So one last thing that I wanted to talk to you about was the assumption that there's always going to be a visible product, something that you could touch. And that isn't always the case with art, particularly art in the 20th century and the 21st century. That hasn't always been the case. But actually, it wasn't even the case in previous periods of time. And I'm showing you here some sand paintings that are also in your book. You can look at the end of your chapter and you'll see these in your book. Because these are an example of how artists have created art that is not permanent. The sand paintings are made by the Navajo Indians and by other Native Americans in the Southwest as a healing ceremony. They're not made to be art. They're not made to be some object that you can put into a museum, where other people can see it. What has happened is that some Native Americans have made examples of these sand paintings by weaving them into carpets or blankets, using other forms of art, and created them to stand as examples, so that people, going to a Native American museum, for example, can see an example of what a sand painting looks like. But some people disagree with these artists that have done that, and they think, no, you shouldn't do that. This is a spiritual ceremony. It's not something to, make a piece of art. But what the artists have usually done is they do something wrong with the image. They make some adjustment to the image so that they're not really producing the image as it would be used in a healing sort of ceremony. So here you're seeing some examples, of Navajo sand painting. The Navajos have a person who is trained to be a medium between humans and the spiritual world. Sometimes this person is called a shaman. That's a very common term that's often used for people that are believed to be mediums in a way, between the human world and the spiritual world. Another name that the Navajo give to these kinds of people, to these shamans, is Hatatli, H-A-T-A-A-L-I, H-A-T-A-A-L-I, Hatatli. And so these are the people that go into training for years, studying with other shaman or Hatatli. And they learn the designs that are supposed to be used for certain kinds of ceremonies. These ceremonies are often accompanied by singing and by dancing, and particularly the chants are also things that the young person who's studying to be a shaman will learn in these long years of study. The Navajos believe that the holy people, who they call, they call them Holy Spirits or holy people. They don't call them gods like we would. That they instructed the Navajo in these ceremonies. And when someone is ill, they will usually, here we're seeing a group of Navajos creating a sand painting, probably as a demonstration of what they're like and not being used as a healing ceremony. Usually the person that's being healed, and it can be a spiritual healing, it could be a physical, he has some physical illness that he's requested this healing for. The person will sit in the center here, and then the design will be created around him in sort of a centrifugal kind of balanced design. Often the images will have images of these gods or these holy spirits. These tall, narrow images that you see here are different holy spirits in the Navajo mythology that are being created here. This is also another holy spirit that this man is creating. And so, these are, very old ceremonies. They're created on very smooth areas of sand, and originally The Navajo used different kinds of minerals, gypsum for white, yellow ochre, sandstones, natural minerals in order to provide the color. But they've modernized, just like other artists have modernized, and so nowadays they generally use pigments, powdered pigments that they buy from art stores, and will use those sometimes for their sand paintings. So once the healing ceremony is completed, the sand painting is destroyed. So this is an example of of an old tradition of art in which there is no product. There isn't a product to admire as we sort of think of art as being admired today. And in the 20th century, a number of artists began to adopt that idea. In fact, one artist in Germany that we will see a little bit later actually thought of himself as a shaman. He thought that art could heal humanity of all the problems that we have in our lives, and he really thought of himself as being a shaman, like these people are shamans. But other artists, haven't taken it that far. They don't see themselves always as being some sort of spiritual medium, but nevertheless, they've taken that idea that an art object does not have to be something that remains always forever for people to see. And these artists are often called installation art artists. This is Anne Hamilton. She is a very well-known installation artist today. She was born in Ohio, and I like to use her because she studied at the University of Kansas. She trained in textile design at the University of Kansas. Then later on, she went to Yale University, and she got her Master of Fine Arts in art. And this is one of her first installations that she created right after she had graduated with her MFA from Yale University. She made what's called the toothpick suit. It isn't called that now, it's just called Body Objects series. But actually what she did was to push toothpicks into these garments that she's wearing, and this is actually her. And then she glued toothpicks to this chair that she has on her back. And then she, wore and she moved around using these toothpicks, and she had herself photographed. So the only way that often installation art remains as something that we can look at or that we can study is in a photograph, because she obviously does not wear this suit all the time. She doesn't walk around with a chair attached to her back, as we see it here. She's very interested in verbal and written language and how it relates to the visual language and sort of the interrelationships, so she's asking us here to interpret this in our way. Often the installation artists are not so concerned about one interpretation that they want everybody to understand. They want every person to bring their own experiences to these installations and to figure out what these installations mean for them. And so she sometimes will not always explain what she's doing within them. For example, we might look at this and it looks very prickly. It looks very much like a porcupine's body, with the quills all raised up, in a defensive sort of posture. It looks rather uncomfortable, unpleasant to think about wearing some kind of garment like that. And to have a chair attached, why would you want a chair attached to your head? Why would you want to sit on that chair, for that matter? To some people, they might look at this and say, well, this really makes me feel uneasy or, uncomfortable. And that may be part of what she was trying to do. She's open to any interpretation of her work. She wants each person to bring their own feelings and experiences in life into this particular work. She's still creating installations today. And this is one example of one of her installations that she created. It's called Privation and Excesses. And what she did was to take a rectangular area of this floor, and she covered it with 750,000 pennies. That's what you're seeing on the floor here, this coppery, sort of shiny material. Those are all pennies. And she first laid out honey so that the pennies are more or less attached, to the surface. And then in this back room right here, and I'll show you a detail in a minute, she put 3 sheep. This is her, actually, sitting on a chair in this installation. And what she's, you might say, well, okay, what kind of connection, can I make between pennies, money, in other words, coins, and sheep that are in that caged room that you see back there? Well, part of what she was trying to, again, besides the fact she'll let you interpret it the way you want, she did have an interpretation in mind. And the interpretation was that both of the pennies as well as the sheep used to have much more significance than they do now. Sheep are very symbolic. Sheep were used in the Middle Age, before the Middle Ages. In the Old Testament, sheep are always referred to as one of the sacrifices that are made in the Jewish temple. They're a gift that's being given to God. After Jesus appears and Christianity develops, Jesus is sometimes referred to as a lamb, the lamb that is sacrificed, his crucifixion being the sacrifice. And then later in the Middle Ages, sheep were used to symbolize Christians, the Christian followers of Jesus. And then in other cultures, sheep, or particularly goats, more than sheep, but sheep are sometimes used as a way of a sort of like a scapegoat. That's where that word comes from, as sort of something to be sacrificed in order to save the herd, or the other sheep. And so sheep, in other words, had lots of spiritual significance in the past. But now, how do we look at sheep? We look at sheep as food, or as, an animal that can provide wool for clothing. We look at sheep in a very practical, ordinary sort of way. We don't look at them as having great spiritual power or significance. And she says, that's the same way with pennies. Pennies used to be very important. And pennies maybe are going to be more important today. But, my son, for example, I used to get on to him because I'm a saver. And whenever he would go into a store and they would hand him pennies as he walked out of the door of the store, he just threw the pennies down. He didn't want them. They just accumulated, in his pockets, and they got too heavy, in his pockets. But it used to be, particularly in the Great Depression in the 1930s, if you had a few pennies, you felt wealthy. They had significance. They were money. They could buy food. But nowadays, they don't seem to have any significance at all. And so she's making, she's talking about, making that comparison between when we're deprived of things, it means more to us. When we have excesses of things, excess of money, then these things don't mean anything for us. And so she says, in a way, they've all been reduced to pets. The penny is no different from the little lamb, that is raised for the 4-H project, maybe. That in some ways they're just pets, to adore and to think are cute or pretty or shiny in the case of the pennies, but they have very little significance beyond that. Here's just, Here's an image of the room with the sheep in them. They're actual live sheep that move around. And so after, an exhibit has been set up for a few days, you begin to have odors as well as just the visual images, that fill this room. And so all of your senses are sort of hit. And she sits here, and often what she will do is she will knit, and I think that's what she was doing here. I couldn't find a slide on the internet that was had good enough resolution, so it comes off blurred, as you see in this work. She will usually have herself within her composition doing something or other. And I think in this case she was knitting because, wool is often used to make yarn to knit with. And so she was knitting. So again, these are temporary exhibits. They stay up for a few weeks in a museum or in some gallery space, and then they're dismantled. And the only evidence that we have of them are the photographs or sometimes the videos that are taken of them. So again, it's impermanent art that's being produced by her. So with that brings us to, the end of talking about some of these different kind of assumptions that people have about art. And so I listed here in the last two slides, the terms, and I've given these terms to you on your handout for the exam. So these are the kind of terms that I would want you to know to be able to identify. And then I also listed, some of the assumptions that have been made about art that we've talked about. And I've expressed it in a little different way, so let's just go through it. We talked about art and crafts, how, artists started out being thought of as craftsmen. They were just skilled people. They were not thought of to have intelligence or to, they didn't really see a need for anything other than just manual skill to be important to artists. But then in the Renaissance that began to change with Leonardo. And he began to say, no, artists have minds. They can explore ideas and concepts, in their art. And so now art and crafts are really thought of as two separate categories. It doesn't mean that art doesn't have skill. It just means that art goes a little bit farther than just skill. And then we also talked about, how artists were educated in the past, and one assumption that sometimes is made that, well, they all go to art schools. They all create the type of art they like, in other words, what they want to make, and that isn't true in the past. Once again, there weren't any art schools, and artists really didn't have much say in what they created. They did not just create art like we do today, where, an artist just goes in his studio and starts to paint and creates his images, and then he hopes he can sell them, but nobody tells him, what to paint. Well, in the past, artists waited until they received a commission from some patron, and usually the patron did tell them what to paint. They still could interpret that subject sometimes and, and use their style to create it, but it wasn't as independent as it is now. And then another thing we talked about was that, and there's an assumption by some people that, well, it's always been in museums. The public's always had the opportunity to see art. Museums didn't develop until the 18th century. And art was often in private collections of the wealthy, of the royal families, the aristocrats in the society. Were the only ones that could afford it and who had it, and common people didn't have a chance to go into their homes and see the art. The only place that the common people could see art were in churches. But again, that began to change in the Renaissance, and wealthy merchants, the middle class, began to buy art. And slowly it evolved until public museums were created. So that we can all go to museums today and see art. And then we talked about, this comment that some people make it, well, I want it to be beautiful. And we talked about reasons maybe that there are times when art shouldn't be beautiful, and that beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. It's defined differently by different people, different periods of time. Art should represent our visual world, art and appearances, which we talked about last time. And often along with that, people have assumed that artists who don't make things that look exactly like they do in life, then they can't be good artists. They must not be skillful enough. And we talked about that. We talked about the understandability of art. And again, often people say, well, if I can't understand it, then the artist isn't very good. And we talked about how symbols have been used by artists, and symbols are cultural. The symbols that are understood in one century may not be understood in another century. That doesn't mean that the artist wasn't a good artist when he created the work using the symbols of his century. It just means that we have to study a little harder in order to understand it. And then finally, we just finished talking about, that artists produce products, unique products that are permanent, that can be seen, and again, that's not always the case either. So, I would want you to be able to discuss these, to discuss why these statements aren't always true, and to give examples of art that would illustrate why, what you're saying about these different things. Okay, I'm going to close this file now, and I'm going to open another file, and we're going to start talking about themes in art. So let me get that open. This is chapter 3 in your book. When we use this word themes in art, and I just remembered I need to hand around the attendance sheet, so let me hand that by while we're talking about themes in art. When we're talking about themes in art, we're talking about the subject matter in art, but individual subjects can often be organized into larger categories. And so the word theme is usually associated with these larger categories. And so I'm going to talk about each of these that I've listed here and give you a few examples of them. And each of these themes that have been used in art also have roles that are related to them, roles of artists, which we've already talked about in Chapter 1, and I've just repeated these roles once again for you to remind you of what we talked about in Chapter 1. Now, I want to go back for a second and, just ask you a question. Which one of these, or ones, maybe there's more than one, which ones of these would you say are relatively new, that are themes that haven't been used, for centuries?
Politics and social order.
Okay. When would you say that began to be used?
Around maybe presidency.
Yeah, actually farther back, because you can think of kings as being political figures too. So, I would say, at least from about the Middle Ages, and actually I'll show you an example. It goes back even farther to Roman period of time. Anything else? But there are some aspects of that, incidentally, that are very contemporary, and we'll talk about that. Anything else that anyone would say is new? Just from what we've talked about so far.
Art and nature, maybe.
Art and nature?
Landscapes and stuff, mountains.
Right. That's relatively new. It has been around since about the 18th century. So, within the span of human existence, that is relatively new. Up until about the 18th century, nature And by nature, usually the way it's represented in art is as a landscape. You're seeing some scene of nature or landscape. Up until the 18th century, people did not think that was an important subject. Why wouldn't they think it's important? Why do you think they thought it was unimportant to represent nature? And why would that be? To capture the people. Well, that would be one thing, and that's one of the roles. Because people carry the stories. They didn't, in the past, artists didn't, and patrons particularly, didn't see the importance of nature. How did it carry a story that had any importance to life? How did it tell about a religious, theme? How did it show anything historical? So nature was thought of as something that you just used to fill up the background. But what was important were the people, as she said. Any other subject that you see here that would be relatively new? It is actually, as we'll talk about, it's not that new. As I'm going to show you one from the Renaissance, and actually it could relate to earlier things. Anytime you're showing something, we've talked about giving a form to something unknown, or, that is an invention. That's the artist using his imagination to create that. So in a way, that is a very old one. Anything else?
Looking outward.
That would be like representing everyday life, or, that's fairly old. Well, there's one there that nobody's really mentioning. The last one, art and art. Art as art. Not art that tells a story about religion, not art that tells about a historical event, just art talking about art. That's probably the newest of these that we're looking at here, because that's really something that developed in the 20th century and has seldom been used. Artists in the past thought of art as functioning in some way. It functioned to tell a story. It functioned to make visible something. And they really didn't think that just talking about what art is was important enough to be in a work of art. One other thing that I want to mention is that all of these themes that we're looking at are not always illustrated alone in a work of art. A work of art can sometimes have several themes, not just one theme. And we'll see that as we go along in looking at some of these examples. So we're going to start out with talking about, I forgot to, about how you determine what a theme is. How do you determine what the artist is saying? Well, look at the images. What's in the painting? What's in the sculpture? That is subject matter. That doesn't entirely tell you what the theme is. But then, after you've sort of identified, what the images are in the work, start thinking about, okay, now how would this period of time have interpreted those things? Is there anything symbolic in those works of art? And in other words, we've talked about this term before, you use iconography, the study of subject matter. You study the subject matter and you try to figure out how would it be interpreted. And that's how you get to the point of understanding what the themes are in a work of art. So we're going to talk about some of these themes and how they're illustrated in art. And the idea is to give you examples of these so that you could then do some of this interpretation on your own. If I gave you a work of art on a test and I said, what theme does that look like this fulfills? By looking at the images and then thinking a little bit about how they're treated, you should be able to come up, with some idea about what the theme is in the art. So we're going to start with the theme of arts in daily life. And the role of the artist that goes along with this is the idea of creating extraordinary versions of ordinary things. And we looked at a cloth that kente that was created in Africa as an example of that. Well, here we're looking at some other examples of ordinary things, practical things, that are made to serve a practical function. These are war shields made by Native Americans in the 19th century, and these were made to protect them. Of course, they didn't protect them from bullets, but in earlier periods of time, they would have given them some protection against arrows, not spears as much as arrows, where you would have more direct force of humans. But an arrow might be slowed down as it broke through the leather that was used to make these, so that maybe it wouldn't penetrate, the man that was standing behind it. But of course, when bullets came along and the white man came along with his guns, these did nothing. But it doesn't mean that the Native Americans quit producing them, because the Native Americans did not think of these as just being practical because they slowed down an arrow. They thought that they had spiritual power also. And the reason that they had spiritual power was because of the images that were placed on these shields. Native American men, all had to seek a personal guardian spirit. That was the thing. A young man, when he had arrived at the age where he could be accepted into the tribe as an adult, would go out on his own, maybe spending a month or so on his own, until he found his personal guardian spirit. And so here on the right, this is an image that was made by a man named No Two Horns. He actually served time in a prison for Native Americans that the U.S. government opened, and began to not only create, his shield was created earlier, but he also began to draw a lot of images of events in his life. So we know a lot about this particular man. And this is his war shield. And he said, that he went out to seek his guardian spirit. And he had a vision of a thunderbird. And so that's what's represented here. And then these wavy lines coming off of the wings of the bird are supposed to represent the thunder, sort of the waves of sound coming off of the bird. Up above, there's a placement of feathers, feathers also down here. Every element in this image is an image he saw in his visions. The visions were sometimes a result of fasting for long periods while they were out, seeking their individual spirits. In some of the tribes, they use peyote, which has hallucinogenic qualities in order to find their personal spirits. For him, it was just fasting until he found his personal spirit. The left one also, is based upon the images of a man named Little Rock. Again, we have a thunderbird right here. There's a crescent moon shape up above the thunderbird. This arrangement of circles is a constellation Pleiades, Pleiades, that he's represented. Some smaller birds, thunderbirds down here. Even the objects he adds to the surface, just as we saw with No Two Horns, are all carefully chosen and placed because that was the vision that he had. They had to record it exactly. So what we see here, is an ordinary object, that has been given a very unique individual image that has a very direct relationship to the person that owned this particular image. And so it becomes something extraordinary. It becomes something out of the ordinary. You don't see more than one of these. Native Americans also did the same thing and I want to go on for a second. I got this out of order. They did this to their clothing. In the late 1880s and 90s, when many of the Native Americans were being placed onto reservations, there was a spiritual prophet, he came from the Paiute tribe, who created the ghost dance, and he said that the ghost dance would return the Native Americans to the power and to ownership of their lands that had been taken away from them by the white man. It would increase the buffalo once again, which had been systematically slaughtered by the white man to try and starve the Native Americans. And so they began to hold ghost dances. Eventually they were outlawed because the U.S. government became very worried that this was creating too much solidarity among the Native American tribes, the different tribes. And instead of fighting each other, they were beginning to unify. And so as a result, the U.S. government outlawed this ghost dance and wouldn't let it be performed any longer. But as a part of the ghost dance, spatial garments were made. Again, with individualized sort of images that were supposed to represent the spirits that they were trying to summon in the ghost dance. And so here you see just two different examples of the one that you're looking at here on the right is the one that's first listed, and the one on the left that's in black and white is the one that was created by the wife of a man named Black Coyote. There are other ways, not just spiritual sort of purposes that these ordinary objects are given, these unusual and very extraordinary expressions. But rather there are, I need to go back to my other slide, there are other just ordinary objects that had no spiritual meaning, but nevertheless were very carefully decorated. Such as the saddle that you're seeing over here on the right. This is a woman's saddle from the Crow tribe. Over here we see the various objects that were created to decorate a horse by a Crow woman. The Crow particularly received a lot of status by how well objects that the men used or wore, how well they were decorated by their women. So in a way it's a very modern idea. The Crow man received special status based upon how decorative the objects were that he used. And so they decorated their horses. Each horse would have a very individualized sort of decoration. And so, again, this is a case of an ordinary object. There wasn't any reason to decorate these. They didn't even have any kind of spiritual protection that they were providing for the horses. This was just a case of status, a status symbol. So it was a very modern idea that the Native Americans, were using. Then another object that was often decorated were buffalo hides. Also, the homes that they lived in, the teepees, particularly for the Plains Indians, which were made out of buffalo hides, would often be decorated with images as well. Or like this particular image would have been an image that would have been set outside of the teepee in front of it. And what these images often depicted were events of the man's life, that lived in that teepee, various hunts or various battles that he had taken part in. And that's what you see represented here. So again, it's taking something rather ordinary and decorating it, particularly in the case of the teepee. Now, in this particular instance that I'm showing you here, because I can't show you a teepee, this you might think of as being more a deliberate art object. It wasn't made for any other reason than to advertise the exploits of this man. But they would also use them on their teepees as well. So these are just a few examples, of where art is used for ordinary objects, used in daily life. Then another theme of art has been the sacred realm, or the religious realm, you could say. And we've talked a little bit about that. One role that we talked about was creating places for some sort of human purpose, such, in this case, a religious purpose. And this is the Parthenon in Athens, Greece. This was a Greek temple that was created to honor the goddess that was believed to have given her name to the city, Athena. Pallas Athena was her name. And so this was erected on the highest point in the city. And by doing that, it really illustrates how important it was to them, that everybody be able to look up to the highest point in the city and see this temple of their goddess, the goddess that they believed had graced them and had given them their name. So, this is just one example. Another example, and I forgot I brought this in just so you could see where it was. This is the Parthenon right here at about the highest point in the city, and this is the ancient city of Greece that lies around it in ruins. Greece, of Athens, it's much larger today than it was in those periods of time. Another example of a religious structure is this stupa. The stupa is a burial mound, and the Buddhists adopted it as one. They have a couple of other religious structures that they build, but they adopted this as a symbol of Buddha when he achieved nirvana. Nirvana is a sort of a timeless state. It has different definitions. It's sort of like a world soul that you're absorbed into if you achieve enlightenment and you die. And so they used the stupa, which was originally a burial mound that had been used for centuries before Buddhism, and they decided we'll make that symbolize nirvana, this final death of Buddha and how he's absorbed into this timeless state. Buddha in Buddhism was originally Siddhartha Gautama, an actual man that ruled, and who they believe, achieved enlightenment, came to an understanding of the world and suffering and how to end suffering in the world. And so this is, the structure that they use is sort of a focus for their religious beliefs. You would walk through this gateway that you see right here, and you had to turn and go this way because it wasn't directly open to the inside. So it sort of made you reorient yourself. You knew that you were leaving ordinary life outside and you were moving into a holy sort of area. And so you would turn, and then you'd turn again, and then that would allow you to enter this open area that surrounds this mound that you see here. And people walk around it and meditate, pray, think about, the teachings of Buddha. You can also go up the stairway to this level and walk around again on this level as well. So again, here's just another example of a religious structure, that's the role, to create this religious structure, and it fits that theme of, the sacred realm or the religious realm. Churches that are built today for, Christian worship are the same, would fit into this same category as well. Then another role for artists in this sacred realm is to give a form to the unknown. And again, we've talked about that the gods are thought of as the unknown, even though Siddhartha was an actual person that lived. No images were made of him in his lifetime. And in fact, after he died, it was several hundred years before the people believed that it was right to make images. Their reasoning was, well, but he no longer exists. He has died, he has achieved nirvana, he's been absorbed back into this universal sort of soul, he doesn't exist any longer. So they would have seen an image of him as being a contradiction to facts. But after, several hundred years, then people began to want an image of him. But when they created the image was not meant to be a portrait. The image that you see here of Buddha is based upon the sutras. The sutras are writings that describe what Buddha is like and that discuss his teachings. And so what the image is here, the image is giving form to ideas about what he was like, but not what he really looked like. And so there are 32 different symbols that have to be used in creating a representation of Buddha. Those symbols are called lakshanas. And you see some of them here in this work. He has a sort of a knob or a top knot on his head. And the sutras say that that represents his wisdom, his supernatural, his great wisdom. And he has, it's a little hard to tell here, he doesn't have earrings on. It almost looks like he has earrings on. He has elongated earlobes, earlobes that are very long, that hang almost down to his shoulders. There are no earrings in there. And the sutras again say this has to be there because Siddhartha was a prince. His father was a king of a tribe near Nepal. And according to the stories about Buddha, he gave up his right to be a prince. So he took his earrings off, large earrings that they wore that probably did stretch their earlobes. And so he has just the long earlobes remaining. And so again, that was a symbol. And then as I said, there are 32 symbols in all that the sutras mention that have to be in an image of Buddha for it to be a true Buddha image. He has to have certain hand gestures. Those are called mudra. I spelled that for you on the screen here. There are different gestures that refer to different events in his life. And there are different ways that he has to have his legs represented. And the legs are asanas. And so that's what that word means, just the position of his legs. So in other words, by the time they began to make these images, they knew nothing about what he looked like. And so these images become very symbolic. They define who he was like and how his teachings are. They tell us about his teachings and the ideas connected with Buddhism rather than just showing us, what he looked like. But the reason they were probably made was to give people something to look at, something to meditate upon, something to think about while they were praying or meditating. And so that's probably why they originally came about. The people had gotten to that point where they wanted this visual image of what Buddha would look like. The same thing has happened with Christianity and images of Jesus. The way that we mostly see Jesus represented today is an image that only developed in about the 13th century. Just like Buddha, when he first died, the Christians had some reluctance to depict him, and there were no portraits made of him unless, you believe that the Shroud of Turin has an image of him on it. There's very little that, we have that really might represent anything he actually looked like. And so when the early Christians were far enough away, he's supposed to have died at about 30 BCE. Then about 300 years later, when Christians were far enough away, once again, from when he had actually lived, they began to want images they could look at and, that they could think about and that they could pray before and meditate on. But they couldn't make up their mind what the image was supposed to look like. And so at first, there were images like this that you're seeing here on the right, where he's depicted as a good shepherd. And this goes back to a story in the Bible where he talks about a parable where he says, if one sheep is lost, the shepherd's going to go out and find it and bring it back to the fold. He's not going to just let it die. And so God is like that. God will try to bring back a sinner. And so to the people at the time, it was sort of a theme of salvation because in the 4th century, they had just finished going through a period of time when Christians were often killed. And they were persecuted by the Roman Empire. And so they really wanted some image that reassured them, no matter what happens to me, no matter if I die, Jesus has said, God will find me, God will save me, and take me to heaven. And so they liked this image, of him as a young shepherd bringing back, a lost lamb. But another image that began to develop was this image that you see here on the left. This is in a church. It's a mosaic above the altar in a church in Rome. This shows Jesus as an older man. He's bearded. He has long hair. He's got a long gown on, and the gown is gold, and these strips right here are actually purple. It doesn't look that here in this image, but they're actually purple. And he's sitting on a jeweled throne. He's being influenced by the way that they showed Roman emperors, and he's being presented as if he's a ruler, as if he's older and wiser. So a very different kind of image from that image of the Good Shepherd that we see. So at first, Christians couldn't figure out which way's the best. Which way should we show Jesus? And there were lots of changes that took place over the next almost 1,000 years as they tried to figure out which way should we show him before they finally came up with the image that we know today, where he usually has. He's older, he has long hair, sometimes a beard, sometimes not a beard, and that sort of became the standard image. But again, it had nothing to do with what he really looked like. It was not a portrait. It was an image that said something about the religion or something about the teachings of the church. And for this, image, it was that at this time, by the 5th century, Christianity was accepted by the Roman Empire. And so they felt like they could start adopting some of these ideas of kingship, like were being shown for the Roman emperors, and they could suggest that Jesus was a king, and that he ruled all the world. And so that's why they showed him like this. So it says something about the doctrine, once more, of the church. Then another role that this theme of sacred realm can illustrate, but this is a case of where we can have another theme as well being presented within the art, is to show stories of the religion. And again, it gives forms to ideas, since these are ideas that didn't necessarily actually take place, and certainly that people weren't able to actually see. And it can also, sort of commemorate, these stories. And so here, for example, you see an image that is associated with Buddha and that tells a story about Siddhartha. In Buddhism, as well as in Hinduism, they believe in reincarnation. They believe that people keep being reborn until they achieve enlightenment, until they understand about the world and how to stop doing the bad things that they do. And so in the stories that grew up around Buddha, they believed that he had gone through several reincarnations before he finally became Siddhartha and achieved enlightenment. And so this is one of the stories about one of his reincarnations. And in this reincarnation, he was a monkey. He was the king of the monkeys. And the story, these are, and I might mention, these are all folk tales. These are older than Buddhism. These are stories that go way back long before Buddha and Buddhism ever developed, and Siddhartha, before he was born. But then they attached them to Buddhism as a way of explaining the different lives of Buddha. And so in this story, there was a king of a land, and he sent out his soldiers to kill the monkeys because they were wreaking havoc with the farmland, and the farmers were complaining. And so, the Monkey King heard about this. And so he stretched himself across a river, or sort of a chasm, so that all of the monkeys could run across his back to get on the other side of the river so that the king's soldiers could not kill them. But the last person, or the last monkey, I should say, that went across his back was a cousin of his named Devadatta. And Devadatta was very jealous of the king of the monkeys. He wanted to be king, sort of like in The Lion King, if you saw that movie. And so Devadatta made sure that as he ran across the back of the king of the monkeys, that he broke his back so that he wouldn't be able to get across, and he would be captured. And that way he thought, Devadatta thought, well, I'll become king of the monkeys then. Well, he didn't know that what was going to happen was that the king felt sorry for the monkey with the broken back. He took him into his household. They cared for him. He got well. And then we see him here sitting, talking to this king, explaining to the king how he had been doing wrong, to do this. So, this was one of the stories. And the idea was that, the moral of the story is that the king of the monkeys saves his people, just as Buddha will save people who believe in Buddhism. And so this, was one of the stories that was associated with Buddha. Well, the same thing has happened, with other images. This is supposedly his conception. He was supposed to have had a miraculous conception, and this is his mother right here. The symbol that they use for this conception is a white elephant. It doesn't have anything to do with an elephant coupling with a girl. It's just a symbol to say this scene represents that scene. And then another scene is to show he renounces his right to be a prince, and he leaves his father's castle, goes out in the world to help people, and so they use the symbol of a riderless horse, and they also show his footprints as a way of showing him, because at first in Buddhism they didn't think it was right to show him as a human. And so this is a way of, showing his stories without really showing him. Well, the same sort of thing has happened in Christianity as well. We have many stories that grew up about, things that happened to Jesus. Not all of them come from the Bible. A lot of them do, but there are also other stories that come out of other writings that weren't included in the New Testament of the Bible. There are also lots of stories about the Virgin Mary. Some are in the Bible, some aren't in the Bible. And so this just shows you how they're represented here on one church. This is from the Gothic period of time. And all of the doorways, all these arches are covered with figures. You see all these figures here. There are figures up in here. This is the crucifixion right here that's being represented. This is Mary being crowned as Queen of Heaven here in the center, which is one of those stories that's not in the Bible. More figures up here. The Gothic churches were just covered with images that told the stories of Christianity. And I brought in off of the central door, on this side of the central door, are these four figures. And these actually are figures that are stories that are in the Bible. These two figures represent the Annunciation, when the angel Gabriel came to Mary and said, you're going to have a baby, and it's the Son of God. And so that's what's represented here. And then these two figures right beside it are what's called the Visitation. And that refers to, again, an event that's in the Bible. Mary knows that her cousin Elizabeth is pregnant, and so Mary goes to visit Elizabeth and to congratulate her. And when she appears in front of Elizabeth, the Holy Spirit tells Elizabeth, this is the mother of the Messiah. This is the mother of the Son of God. And so Elizabeth immediately knows that Mary is pregnant also. And just offhand, Elizabeth is the mother of St. John the Baptist. And so these two images are a symbolic representation of the rosary. They're the first words in the rosary. In the rosary, it starts out with, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. And that is the Annunciation part. And then the second part of it is, blessed among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. And that is supposed to be what Elizabeth says to Mary when she sees Mary. So the first part of the rosary are actually illustrated here on the church. And people at that time would have recognized that and would have recognized a lot of these other stories. So, in Christianity also, art has been used to record these stories and to record, doctrines that the church teaches and that the church believes in. Okay, we're going to stop right here and we'll start talking about politics next time.